The invitation arrived like a blade slipped between her ribs, disguised in ivory and silver script. Evangelene Harper had been sorting through the morning's mail, stacking bills in one pile, gallery magazines in another, when her fingers froze on the envelope. She didn't need to open it. The embossed return address told her enough. Theodore Grayson and Sophia Bennett cordially invited her to witness their union. Theodore, the man she had spent 4 years planning a future with. Sophia, the friend she had trusted since her first days at university. The betrayal was absolute, a wound so deep it hollowed her in a single breath. She sat motionless in her home office, surrounded by proof of the life she had built. Canvases leaning against the walls, trophies of Manhattan's cutthroat art world, her name whispered at galleries where critics praised her vision. It should have been triumph, but none of it mattered now. The room blurred as her gaze landed on the unfinished painting across from her desk. She had been crafting it as a wedding gift. Theodore's proposal in Central Park, the swirl of autumn leaves caught in the air, the memory gilded in paint. Now it mocked her, a relic of lies she hadn't yet recognized. Her hand trembled as she tore the envelope open anyway, as if seeing the words would help them make sense. The elegant script confirmed her nightmare. Sophia Bennett, her closest confidant, was taking the place that once belonged to her. Evangelene laughed bitterly, a sharp sound in the silence. 4 years erased by one deceitful choice. 4 years of whispered promises, quiet faith, and 1,000 moments she had thought were hers alone. Her phone buzzed on the desk. Messages from friends flooded in, pity disguised as concern. No doubt the gossip had already raced through their circle. Evangelene Harper, artistic genius, discarded for her best friend. She let the phone vibrate itself into silence. She couldn't bear to read their sympathy, not when humiliation pressed against her chest like a weight she couldn't lift. Theodore's last email still lingered in her inbox, unopened. Subject line, "We should talk." She hovered her finger over the trackpad, tempted to see what justification he'd spun, what half-truths he thought would soothe the sting. Instead, she shut the laptop with a decisive snap. There was nothing left to hear. Her Manolos echoed against the oak floor as she crossed to the window. Manhattan stretched before her, sharp and glittering, a city of ambition that had once felt like her ally. Now every tower seemed hostile, each street corner a memory waiting to ambush her. Somewhere out there, Theodore and Sophia were likely entwined in their perfect vision, sipping champagne while she unraveled. The ache burned hotter, shifting from grief to fury. She would not give them the satisfaction of watching her break. If she stayed, every glance, every headline, every whisper would chain her to this betrayal. She needed distance, anonymity, air that wasn't poisoned with their names. Her laptop reopened, not for Theodore's email this time, but for the airline site. Miami glowed on the screen, loud, chaotic, wild, a place where people went to lose themselves and be reborn. Perfect. She booked the earliest flight without hesitation. Within hours, she was in her bedroom, pulling gowns and casual silks from her closet, stuffing them into her Gucci suitcase without care. Each dress seemed haunted, stitched with memories of evenings spent with Theodore and Sophia. She ripped them from hangers with a vengeance, determined to leave their ghosts behind. Her phone rang again. Sophia's smiling face filled the screen, a photo from their London trip back when Evangelene still believed friendship was sacred. Rage surged hot and immediate. She hit decline, then blocked the number. There would be no explanations, no apologies. Some wounds demanded silence. The doorman raised his brows when he took her bags, but he asked no questions. "Will you be gone long, Miss Harper?" he offered gently. "I'm not sure," she answered truthfully, sliding into the waiting cab. As the car wove through the city, Evangelene pressed her forehead against the cool glass. She thought of the painting she had slashed in her studio before leaving, the palette knife tearing through the canvas in one clean stroke. It was the first step in erasing the life that had betrayed her. The city lights blurred into streaks of gold and white as she approached LaGuardia. Her heart was still heavy, her trust still shattered, but beneath it all a flicker burned, a faint, defiant spark. She was wounded, yes, but somewhere inside, beneath layers of hurt, a strength waited to be claimed. As the cab pulled up to the terminal, Evangelene Harper lifted her chin. She wasn't running from New York. She was stepping toward something new, even if she didn't yet know its shape. The invitation had ended one life, but perhaps, just perhaps, it had also opened the door to another. She would board that flight with nothing but resolve and a fractured heart. Fate, though, had already set its pieces in motion. And soon, Miami would give her something she could never have imagined. The rush of humid Miami air pressing against Evangelene's skin as she stepped from the cab outside the Fontainebleau. Neon lights shimmered across the oceanfront boulevard, bending and rippling as though the city itself were alive and testing her resolve. She carried her suitcase through the gilded lobby where chandeliers fractured the light into dizzying patterns. People in sequined dresses and linen suits moved past her in currents of laughter, drink in hand, their lives unbothered and careless. Evangelene felt like an intruder, a shattered figure trying to stitch herself into a world of noise and brilliance. The receptionist greeted her with rehearsed warmth and slid over a key card for a suite that looked out over the endless stretch of sand. The room was lavish, the kind of place honeymooners paid fortunes for, yet she barely noticed the silk drapes or the champagne chilling in a silver bucket. She wanted to vanish inside the anonymity of this city, not be reminded of a life that mocked her. She poured herself a drink from the minibar and let the bite of vodka burn away some of the numbness. Hours later, she forced herself into a black dress, one that clung to her body like armor. She painted her lips red, the color of defiance, and descended to the hotel bar. Music pulsed from the speakers, a beat that vibrated through her chest and dulled the ache in her heart. Strangers surrounded her, tourists chasing thrill, locals chasing escape, and for the first time since the invitation, she felt unseen. She chose a corner stool, the shadows wrapping around her as if conspiring in her secrecy. The bartender asked what she wanted. A cosmopolitan, strong. He poured it without hesitation. She lifted the glass and let the cold rim press against her mouth like a promise. That was when she felt it, a gaze that clung to her longer than casual curiosity. She turned her head and saw him at a table across the room. Alone, but not lonely. His posture radiated control, his eyes sharpened with focus. He was not watching the crowd. He was watching her. The man rose with a grace that unsettled her, threading through the chaos with steps that felt inevitable. Each movement drew him closer, and though she told herself to look away, her pulse betrayed her. He stopped at her side, his voice low, rich, with an accent she couldn't quite place. "Is this seat taken?" She answered without thinking. "Depends who's asking." He smiled, the expression slow and devastating. "Cassian Veil," he said, extending his hand. She hesitated before placing hers in his, and a spark jolted through her veins. There was something dangerous in the way he looked at her, as if he could see the pain she thought she was hiding. "You look like you're running from something," he observed. "Or towards something," she countered, forcing a brittle laugh. She raised her glass in a mock toast. "Want to get married?" The words tumbled out half bitter joke, half challenge, meant to startle him away. But he did not laugh. He did not smirk. He held her eyes as though her soul was inked in them. "Yes," he said simply. The bar seemed to quiet around her, the music dimming, the laughter blurring into static. Evangelene nearly choked on her drink. She searched his face for irony, for arrogance, for the punchline she was sure must follow. But there was none, only certainty. She whispered that she was joking, but Cassian's gaze never wavered. "Were you?" In that instant, the air shifted, heavy with a tension that was equal parts danger and desire. A stranger had taken her wounded joke and turned it into something raw, something possible. She should have fled, laughed it off, returned to the safety of her solitude. Yet instead she stayed rooted to her seat, her heart racing, a strange hunger building where grief had lived. Miami, she realized, was about to test her in ways New York never had. And this man, this Cassian Veil, was not going to let her escape with only a drink and a broken heart. The blur of Miami's neon-drenched streets. Evangelene walked beside Cassian, her heels clicking against the pavement while her pulse thundered louder than the music spilling from every club doorway. She told herself this was madness, that she was following a stranger through a city where she knew no one, yet every step forward felt like gravity. Cassian moved with a calm assurance, weaving through the noise and chaos as though the city itself parted for him. They passed murals lit by floodlights, street performers breathing fire, couples kissing against walls, and still, she felt detached from it all, as though her world had shrunk to the magnetic pull of the man at her side. He asked nothing, demanded nothing, yet his silence spoke louder than the words she wanted to resist. She tried to break the tension with a laugh. "You really took me seriously back there. I was joking." Cassian stopped beneath a flickering sign that hummed in the humid air. He turned to her, his expression carved with certainty. "You don't strike me as a woman who hides behind jokes. You meant it, even if just for a second. Admit it." Her breath caught because he was right. For a split moment, asking a stranger to marry her had felt like freedom. She swallowed hard, refusing to give him the victory of her confession. "And if I did, then I will give you the only answer I know," he replied. "Yes." The single word unsettled her more than any declaration could have. He was not a man playing at charm. He was a man stating fact. And in that instant she realized he was not chasing her for pleasure or conquest. He was choosing her. They walked on until a chapel appeared at the corner, its neon glow a gaudy promise of eternal vows. Evangelene froze, her heart slamming against her ribs. The sign read, "Open 24 hours." Couples stumbled inside, some laughing, some already crying, each surrendering to a wild gamble. Cassian's gaze slid from the chapel to her face. "Last chance to run," he murmured. The words should have sent her fleeing into the night, yet instead she found herself trembling with something that felt alarmingly close to anticipation. She thought of Theodore's empty excuses, Sophia's cruel betrayal, the slow death of a life lived for appearances. For the first time in years, Evangelene wanted to leap without knowing where she would land. "Sanity is overrated," she whispered, surprising herself. Cassian's smile was slow and devastating as he took her hand and guided her through the chapel doors. Inside, plastic flowers wilted beneath buzzing lights, and an officiant in a rumpled suit shuffled papers. It was tacky, absurd, and yet somehow perfect. Evangeline's hand shook as she signed her name, but when Cassian leaned in close, his voice steadied her. "You're not running anymore. You're choosing." And when the officiant told him to kiss his bride, Cassian's lips claimed hers with a hunger that burned through every shard of her broken past. It was reckless, it was terrifying, and it was the first moment that felt real in a very long time. Outside, the Miami night erupted with the sound of passing cars and distant music, but Evangelene barely heard it. All she could feel was the weight of a silver band now circling her finger, and the wild certainty that her life had just been torn open and rewritten in a single kiss. She had fled New York to escape betrayal, but in one impulsive night she had entered something far more dangerous, something that already threatened to consume her. And though fear whispered at the edges of her mind, another voice rose louder, stronger. It was the voice of possibility. Sunlight spilling through glass walls so tall they seemed to scrape the clouds. Evangelene woke to the scent of salt air and the cool weight of silk sheets, her eyes adjusting to the view of Miami stretched out like a jeweled tapestry below. For one suspended second she thought she had dreamed it all, the chapel lights, the trembling signature, the kiss that had felt like fire. But then her gaze fell to her left hand, and the glint of silver on her finger silenced every doubt. She was married to a man she had known for less than a night. The sound of running water drew her attention to the bathroom. The door stood ajar, steam curling out like whispers, and inside a shadow moved. Cassian Veil, the stranger who was no longer a stranger, the man who had looked at her as if she was the only person who mattered in the chaos of Miami. Her chest tightened as he stepped into the doorway, bare except for a towel slung low on his hips, droplets of water racing down the ridges of muscle that spoke of a life built on discipline. His eyes met hers, and instead of the smug grin she expected, he offered a quiet smile that carried more weight than any practiced line. "Good morning, Mrs. Veil." The title struck her like a lightning bolt. She tried to laugh, to push it away with a quip, but the sound faltered. Her world had tilted in ways she couldn't comprehend. He crossed the room and set a tray on the bed, laden with croissants, berries, and 2 glasses of champagne. A celebration, he explained, of what they had done, of what lay ahead. Before she could respond, a knock sounded at the door. Cassian opened it, and a pair of staff entered briskly, their movements polished and reverent. They addressed him with deference, calling him Sir, calling her Mrs. Veil, laying out newspapers and murmuring that the morning headlines had already broken the news. Evangeline reached for the nearest paper with shaky fingers. The front page was a photo of last night's chapel, the kiss caught mid-embrace, her laughter frozen, his hand firm at her waist. The headline read, "Veil married in Miami, mystery bride revealed as artist Evangelene Harper." The words blurred as shock thundered through her. Veil. The name carried weight even she, entrenched in the art world, understood. Veil Enterprises. The dynasty that owned skyscrapers, tech empires, and pieces of governments. Cassian was not simply a man she had met at a bar. He was one of the most powerful figures in America, and she had married him. Her pulse stuttered between fear and awe. She searched his face for explanation, accusation, anything. He sat across from her calmly, his gaze steady. "You saw me," he said softly, "not the Veil name. That is why I didn't tell you. For one night I wanted to be a man, not an empire." She pressed the paper to her chest, her mind warring with the impossible truth. She had left New York to flee betrayal, yet somehow she had stepped into a world where betrayal, ambition, and love would not only collide, but decide her fate. Theodore and Sophia would already have seen the headlines. Every critic, every rival, every friend who had pitied her would now choke on her name spoken alongside his. The room felt too small for the storm inside her. She rose, moving toward the wall of glass, staring down at the ocean as if it might hold the answers. Behind her, Cassian's footsteps approached, quiet but unyielding. His hand brushed her shoulder, grounding her. "You can walk away," he whispered, "but if you stay as my wife." The choice should have been easy. Logic screamed at her to run, to undo the madness before it consumed her. But when she turned, his eyes locked with hers, unflinching, raw, and real. In that gaze, she saw not the empire, not the danger, but the man who had chosen her without hesitation. And despite every fear clawing at her, she realized the truth. She didn't want to run. Not anymore. Chapter 5 opened with the hum of the private jet slicing through clouds as the skyline of Manhattan came into view. Evangeline sat by the window, her hand wrapped protectively around the silver band that still felt too heavy for her finger. Beneath her calm mask, questions burned. She had fled betrayal, only to land in a world of staggering wealth and dangerous visibility. Beside her, Cassian worked with quiet intensity, his phone alive with messages, his presence both commanding and unnervingly steady. When he glanced at her, it wasn't with the arrogance of power, but with the certainty of a man who had already made his choice. The jet touched down at Teterboro, and suddenly her reality shifted again. A convoy of sleek black cars waited on the tarmac, engines purring like beasts held on a leash. Men in suits, discreet but sharp-eyed, formed a protective wall as if the world itself was already reaching for them. Evangeline followed Cass, and down the stairs, the weight of cameras, invisible but inevitable, pressing against her. For the first time, she wasn't sure if she was stepping into safety or a gilded cage. The ride through the city was a blur of flashing lights and honking horns, but Cassian's grip on her hand never faltered. He told her what awaited at Veil Tower, the fortress of glass and stone that bore his family name. His mother, Margaret Veil, was waiting. A woman whispered about in boardrooms and society galas, a matriarch as formidable as she was elegant. Evangeline's heart tightened. She had lost one family in betrayal. Was she about to walk into another where she didn't belong? When the elevator opened into the penthouse, Evangeline's breath caught. The space was less home than cathedral, marble floors gleaming under chandeliers, walls alive with masterpieces she had studied in textbooks. Yet amid the grandeur, her gaze fell on something impossible. One of her own paintings, an early work she had sold years ago, hung, framed in perfect light. It was a reminder that someone here already knew her beyond Cassian's reckless choice. Then Margaret Veil appeared, descending the staircase with the grace of a queen. Her eyes swept Evangelene with surgical precision before she crossed the room and offered a smile that carried both warmth and warning. "So you are the woman my son chose without a word of notice. Welcome to the family. Though next time, perhaps you'll allow me the courtesy of attending the wedding." Evangelene braced for cold dismissal, but instead Margaret took her hand and guided her toward the suite that had already been prepared. The rooms overflowed with fresh flowers, tailored gowns in her size, even a private studio stocked with supplies she hadn't dared ask for. It was overwhelming, intoxicating, and terrifying all at once. That night, as she stood on the terrace overlooking the city that had once felt like hers, Evangelene realized how fast the ground beneath her had shifted. She was no longer the betrayed woman running from New York. She was Mrs. Veil, wife to a man who could bend the world to his will. But with that power came enemies, whispers, and dangers she had yet to see. Behind her, Cassian slid an arm around her waist, his voice low against her ear. "You belong here more than anyone. But know this, Evangelene. Now that you are mine, the world will test you, and some will try to break you." She leaned into his warmth, a shiver racing down her spine. Somewhere in the city below, Theodore and Sophia would be reading the news, their triumph hollowed in an instant. The thought should have comforted her, but instead it stirred a darker unease. Because she understood what Cassian had just given her wasn't only protection. It was a declaration of war. The sound of voices echoing across the grand salon of Veil Tower. Evangelene descended the staircase in a gown Margaret had insisted she wear, a deep sapphire silk that shimmered like water beneath candlelight. She had spent years slipping into couture for galas, yet tonight felt different. Tonight every eye in the room was waiting to judge her not as Evangelene Harper the artist, but as Mrs. Veil. Her pulse quickened as she caught sight of the crowd below. Politicians, financiers, critics, collectors, titans who could make or break reputations with a single whisper. Cassian stood at the center of it all, tall and unyielding in his black suit, a figure who drew gravity to himself. His gaze found hers instantly, cutting through the sea of glittering strangers. The smallest nod from him grounded her, a silent promise that she wasn't alone in this war of appearances. Still, Evangelene felt the tension coil inside her as she descended, aware of the whispered questions trailing behind her. Who was she, this woman who had captured the most powerful bachelor in the city? Margaret moved beside her, every inch the poised matriarch. She introduced Evangelene with a voice that carried finality. "This is my daughter-in-law, Mrs. Evangelene Veil." The title landed like thunder. No correction, no hesitation. It was a shield. Yet Evangelene saw the flickers of envy and skepticism etched into the smiles of those who approached. They wanted to know if she was strong enough to hold the place she had claimed overnight. The night deepened with the clinking of glasses, conversations laced with veiled threats, and questions designed to test her composure. But it was when she caught sight of Theodore across the room that her breath faltered. He had not been invited. She was sure of it. Yet there he was, his expression brittle, Sophia glued to his arm in a dress too bright, too desperate. Their presence was a provocation, a challenge thrown at her feet. Cassian's arm brushed hers lightly, warning and reassurance woven into the gesture. "Do you want me to have them removed?" he murmured, his voice low enough for her alone. Evangelene shook her head, steel sharpening inside her. "No, let them see." When Theodore finally approached, his smirk was thin and brittle. "So this is the life you've traded me for, a stranger's empire." His words were meant to cut, but they only revealed his weakness. Evangelene met his gaze with a calm he had never seen in her before. Not traded, freed. She turned away before he could answer, her dismissal more brutal than any insult. Cassian's hand tightened around hers, pride burning in his eyes. As the night waned, Evangelene slipped into the terrace for air. The city sprawled below, alive and relentless, and she felt its pulse match her own. She was no longer the woman who had fled betrayal with tears in her eyes. She was something new, forged in risk and fire. But the whisper of danger still lingered, because as much as Cassian's world offered power and protection, it also carried enemies who would do anything to see them fall. Behind her, Cassian joined her at the railing, his presence steady, his voice dark with promise. "This is only the beginning, Evangelene. Tonight you showed them you belong. But you need to understand, those who want to break us will not come with words. They will come with war." The city lights burned brighter as if in agreement, and Evangelene felt the chill of truth settle over her. She had stepped into a life far greater than the one she had lost, but also far more perilous. And she was ready. Because for the first time, she was not facing the storm alone. The morning sun bleeding through the glass walls of Evangelene's private studio in Veil Tower. Canvases leaned against every surface, some half-finished, others slashed in frustration when memory overpowered inspiration. The city roared below, but inside the studio there was only silence and the steady thrum of her heart. She pressed her palm to her stomach, unsettled by the wave of nausea that had been haunting her for days. At first she thought it was nerves or the endless parade of society events, but a suspicion whispered at the edge of her thoughts, one she had not dared to voice. The door opened and Cassian entered, his presence commanding even in the soft light. He carried a tablet under one arm, his face set with grim focus. The headlines were already spiraling. Photos of Theodore and Sophia smiling at a gala circulated with venomous captions, painting Evangelene as the woman scorned who had married into power for revenge. Cassian set the tablet aside with a sharp motion. Their noise means nothing. What matters is us. But his jaw was tight, his eyes darker than usual. She sensed the storm beneath his calm. Before she could answer, the intercom buzzed. Winston, the family's chief of staff, announced a visitor demanding entry. Theodore Grayson. Evangelene's blood turned cold. Cassian's immediate response was fury, his voice low and dangerous. "He will not set foot in this tower." But Evangelene placed a hand on his chest, her voice steady despite the tremor inside her. "Let me face him. If I hide, he wins." Minutes later, she waited in the azure room, its vast windows pouring light over rare antiques that whispered of history and power. When Theodore entered, his tailored suit could not hide the shadows etched across his face. He froze when his eyes fell to her, then drifted to her hand, resting protectively over her stomach. His expression shifted, shock slicing through arrogance. "You're pregnant," his voice cracked. "With him." "My husband," Evangelene corrected, her tone like glass. "Yes," two words that severed the last tether of their past. Theodore stumbled forward, his confidence unraveling. "I made a mistake. Sophia was... I thought..." Evangelene cut him off, her eyes steady and cold. "You thought wrong. You thought my loyalty would blind me forever. You thought my silence was weakness. But it was strength. And now, you're nothing but a ghost in a story I've outgrown." Theodore faltered, his lips trembling around words he could not find. For the first time, she saw him not as the man who had betrayed her, but as a small, broken figure dwarfed by a life he could never control. She turned her back on him, signaling Winston to escort him out. When Cassian met her in the hall, his arms open and protective, she did not collapse into him as she once might have. Instead, she held herself tall, her voice calm. "I am free." Cassian's eyes burned with pride, though the tension in his shoulders told her he was already thinking of the enemies circling closer. That night, as they prepared for the gala that would thrust her into society's spotlight once more, Evangelene caught her reflection in the mirror. The gown shimmered against her body, her face was composed, but it was her eyes that startled her. They no longer carried the fragility of a woman betrayed. They carried the fire of a woman reborn. Cassian clasped a necklace around her throat, his lips brushing her ear. "The world will test us harder now," he whispered. "They will come for you, for the children, for everything we are building. But they will fail, because I will burn this city down before I let them take you." Evangelene met his gaze in the mirror, unflinching. "Let them come." I am not afraid anymore. The night outside was alive with glitter and shadows, the city preparing for spectacle, unaware that beneath the surface forces were already aligning to tear them apart. And for the first time, Evangeline was ready to meet them head-on. A storm rolling over Manhattan, lightning splitting the sky as if warning of the chaos to come. Inside Veil Tower, the atmosphere mirrored the weather. Evangeline stood frozen in the doctor's office, the steady echo of the words still pounding in her ears. Not one, not two, three. She was carrying triplets. For a long moment she couldn't breathe, her mind stumbling between awe and fear. She pressed her trembling hands against her stomach as if to shield the fragile lives within. Cassian sat beside her, his usual composure shaken, his eyes wide with a raw emotion she had never seen. When the doctor left, silence filled the space, heavy and reverent. Then Cassian leaned forward, cupping her face with both hands, his voice a whisper breaking with power. You have given me an empire greater than any I could ever build. 3 lives. Our lives. His forehead pressed to hers, and for the first time, Evangeline saw the man who carried the weight of dynasties reduced to something achingly human. But news traveled faster than they could contain. By evening, whispers of Evangeline's pregnancy spread across the city like wildfire. Socialites speculated in hushed voices, rivals sharpened their knives, and media outlets clamored for a photograph that would confirm the rumor. Margaret Veil, ever the strategist, summoned them into her study, the room glowing with lamplight and the weight of family history. You must understand, she warned, that children in this family are not only the heirs. They are targets. Protect them before they are even born. The warning proved prophetic. At the gala that night, the tension was thicker than the perfume lacing the air. Evangeline stepped into the ballroom on Cassian's arm, her gown flowing like midnight silk, her chin lifted with quiet defiance. She felt the stares searing her, some with envy, some with malice. And then she saw them, Theodore and Sophia, lingering near the bar, their smiles brittle, their eyes sharp. They had come not as guests, but as vultures circling the edge of her new life. Sophia's voice cut across the music when she approached. Congratulations, Ava. You've certainly climbed high for someone who used to beg for scraps of love. Her words were coated in venom, meant to humiliate, meant to drag her back into the shadows of betrayal. Evangeline's hand tightened on her glass, but before she could speak, Cassian's voice thundered low and dangerous. Watch your tongue, Sophia. You are standing in my house, under my name. The crowd hushed, their attention snapping to the confrontation. Theodore stepped forward, his face twisted with regret and rage. She was supposed to be mine. The confession slipped from him like a desperate wound, and gasps rippled through the ballroom. Evangeline felt the moment seize like a spotlight on a stage. Every eye was upon her. She turned to Theodore, her voice steady and lethal. I was never yours. I was only ever a cage you mistook for love. The silence that followed was devastating, her words slicing through him with finality. He staggered back, his face ashen, Sophia gripping his arm in panic. But even as Theodore and Sophia crumbled, Evangeline sensed something darker stirring at the edges of the night. Cassian's phone vibrated with an urgent call. His expression shifted as he listened, his jaw tightening, his free hand curling into a fist. When he hung up, he leaned close to her ear, his voice a blade. It's not just gossip anymore. Someone has moved against us. Evangeline's heart pounded as lightning flashed through the ballroom windows. She knew then that their enemies were no longer whispering in shadows. They were striking. And she, carrying the future of the Veil dynasty inside her, stood at the very heart of the storm. The echo of thunder. But this time it wasn't the storm outside. It was the sound of footsteps pounding through Veil Tower's private halls. Cassian returned from the urgent call with eyes dark as obsidian, his suit jacket unbuttoned, his tie loose, as though he had fought the night itself. Evangeline rose from the sofa, her heart already racing, her hand instinctively covering her stomach. Tell me, she whispered. Cassian's gaze locked on hers, fierce and unflinching. Isabella Cortez is here. And she's not here for me. She's here for you. The name sliced through Evangelene like glass. Isabella, the woman Cassian had once been arranged to marry, the heiress whose family empire carried old grudges and even older ambition. She imagined her rival now, beautiful, polished and venomous, arriving in New York not to claim Cassian but to destroy the woman who had taken her place. Cassian paced the room like a predator caged. She's been gathering allies, leaking poison to the press, funding whispers of fraud in Veil Enterprises, and now she's threatened to expose something more. Evangelene felt the room tilt. Expose what? Cassian's silence was answer enough. There were secrets in the foundations of the Veil Empire, debts and deals inked by men long dead, but still dangerous. If Isabella pulled them into light, everything they had built would ignite. That night the gala at the Metropolitan Museum was transformed into a battlefield draped in silk and diamonds. Evangelene entered at Cassian's side, her gown black as midnight, her eyes lined with steel. Cameras flashed, questions were hurled, but she walked as though she were untouchable. Across the marble floor, Isabella appeared, her emerald gown gleaming, her smile carved like a blade. When their eyes met, the air between them snapped with unspoken war. Isabella's words were velvet-wrapped daggers. You're brave, Evangelene, stepping into a world you don't understand. But bravery doesn't save queens. It buries them. Evangelene forced her lips into a smile, her voice smooth. Then you should know, Isabella. I was not born to be a queen. I was born to be the storm that drowns them. The crowd gasped. The orchestra faltered, but Cassian's hand at her back steadied her. Isabella's smile faltered for a flicker, but her eyes gleamed with something darker. We'll see how brave you are when your husband's empire crumbles and your children are born into ashes. It was then Evangelene understood this was no longer a battle of society galas or whispered rumors. Isabella had declared open war. Cassian leaned down, his breath hot against her ear. She has crossed the line. And now we cross it too. That night as they left the gala, sirens screamed in the distance, headlines already exploding online. Anonymous leaks hinted at investigations into Veil Enterprises, the words corruption and fraud pulsing across every screen. Margaret Veil was waiting in the car, her face carved from stone. She looked at Evangelene, her eyes sharp, her voice unyielding. If you choose to stand with my son now, there is no turning back. You will not only fight for him, you will fight for this dynasty, for the children you carry, for everything our enemies want to erase. Evangelene pressed her hand to her stomach and met Margaret's gaze without flinching. Then let them come, because I will not run again. The car sped into the night, the city lights flashing past like sparks in the dark. Evangelene knew the final storm had broken. Love had carried her this far. Now it would be tested against fire, betrayal, and the ruthless hunger of those who wanted to see them destroyed. And somewhere inside her, the fragile spark of strength she once doubted had now erupted into flame, the city trembling under the weight of headlines. News outlets screamed of investigations into Veil Enterprises, rumors of fraud, whispers of collapse. Evangelene stood at the tall windows of the penthouse, her reflection fractured by lightning slashing the sky. Inside her, the triplets moved as though sensing the storm outside, reminding her with every flutter that this was no longer just about survival. This was about legacy. Cassian returned from a night of war in boardrooms and backroom meetings, his tie loose, his voice hoarse from defending what was theirs. He pulled Evangelene into his arms, his chest thundering like a war drum. Isabella has gathered senators, investors, even allies from abroad. But she underestimated one thing. She underestimated you. The plan was set in motion the next evening at the Veil Art Gala, an event originally meant to showcase Evangelene's latest work. Now it was repurposed as a battlefield dressed in velvet and light. The grand hall glowed with chandeliers, the walls lined with her paintings, canvases of storms and fire, of broken wings rising again. Every guest who entered was greeted not by whispers of scandal, but by the sight of Evangelene Harper standing proud, her hand on her stomach, her eyes bright with defiance. Isabella arrived late, as if to command the night, emerald gown trailing like venom. She moved through the crowd with calculated grace, her voice dripping poison into every ear. When she reached the center of the hall, she raised her glass and smiled at Evangelene. "Lovely party. A shame it may be your last before the empire burns." Evangelene stepped forward, her voice ringing through the hall. "You came to see me broken, but what you forget, Isabella, is that I was broken once already, and I survived." She gestured to her paintings, to the photos, Phoenix rising from flames to the storm clearing into dawn. "This is who I am. Not your pawn, not your rival. I am proof that betrayal creates warriors, and you will not destroy what I have built with love." The crowd erupted, the tide turning before Isabella's eyes. Investors who had wavered moments earlier now whispered of strength, of resilience, of loyalty to Cassian Veil's vision. Isabella's face faltered, rage flashing before she could mask it. She tried to counter, pulling papers from her clutch, documents meant to expose buried scandals. But Cassian was ready. He raised his hand, and screens lit around the hall, projecting files of his own. Evidence that Isabella's empire had bribed officials, laundered money, corrupted markets. The hall gasped as truth became spectacle. Margaret Vale stepped into the light then, her voice calm but lethal. "Enough. My family does not kneel to threats. Tonight you tried to erase us, Isabella, but all you did was expose yourself." Guards moved in, guests recoiled, and Isabella's empire crumbled in public view. She was escorted out, her emerald gown a trail of defeat, her smile gone, her war lost. When the doors closed behind her, Evangelene felt the world shift. The battle was over. Not only had they survived, they had triumphed. Cassian turned to her, his eyes wet with unspoken relief, his hands cupping her face. "You saved us," he whispered. "You saved me." Weeks later, the storm passed and the city began to heal. The triplets were born on a night when snow blanketed Manhattan in silence. 3 tiny cries filled the hospital room, shattering the last remnants of fear in Evangelene's heart. Cassian held them, his face undone by joy, whispering names like promises: Orion, Luna, Stella. The future had arrived, fragile and infinite. 5 years later, the Vale Art Hub stood as Evangelene's legacy, a haven for young artists who had been silenced by betrayal, given a voice through her vision. Her children raced through its halls, laughter echoing against walls filled with color and light. Cassian watched her from across the gallery, his expression soft, reverent. That night, beneath the glow of a finished painting of a phoenix soaring into dawn, Cassian kissed her hand and whispered, "We won because you never stopped believing in us." Evangelene looked at her children, at the art that bore her soul, at the man who had chosen her when she had nothing left to give. And she knew the truth. The best revenge had never been revenge at all. It had been love strong enough to silence the past, fierce enough to build a future. And in that moment, Evangelene Harper Vale, once betrayed and broken, stood as everything her enemies feared and everything her heart had once thought impossible. A wife, a mother, an artist, a force. A storm that had not only survived but remade the world in her own image,